Yeah. Thanks, Katie, for this kind introduction. It was a pleasure sharing an office with you this semester. And let me start by saying thank you to my fellow fellows at CAPAS here for the discussions over the last couple of months. I profited a lot from our exchanges. And I would like also to say thank you to the whole CAPAS team, of course to Robert, Thomas, but also Laura, Teresa, Gregor, of course, who helped with organizing the series, but also our stays here in Heidelberg. Yeah, being the last one of the series of this term is a tricky task, but I will try my best. My project here at CAPAS was about looking at the nuclear threat and the climate change as two crucial event horizons with specific temporalities within a configuration that we could term absolute present, endless present, or presentism, as it were. And I'm especially interested in how the construction of time must be thought so that we avoid getting trapped in the political impasse of some sort of mutual stabilization of catastrophism and presentism. So at its core, my project is about temporality. But the lecture today won't be a summary or kind of overview of this project, because in the process of preparing the lecture, it turned into some sort of rather preliminary conceptual work on historical temporalities, which was influenced mainly by our exchanges over the last weeks. So anyways, I hope this presentation will be productive for further discussion, and I hope also you can hear me well in this kind of strange setting of this room. So, and I will now start with the presentation. Why is the apocalypse resurfacing in our contemporary situation? Not only as imagery, as rhetoric or discourse, but also as a figure of thought, a mode of temporality. At first, there seems to be an obvious explanation. In the present, we are observing events, processes, or developments that entail consequences or potential outcomes of quasi-apocalyptic scale. Slavoj Žižek, for example, in several texts and books, who is a well-known figure here, has identified 4 forms of these apocalyptic threats, the 4 riders of the apocalypse. The ecological crisis, the biogenetic revolution, systemic imbalances, and the growth of social divisions and exclusions. Interestingly, the nuclear threat is missing in this picture. It is worth recalling that in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, the novelty of the atomic bomb was discussed as a symbol of humans' technical capability to bring about doom in the literal sense. The new situation brought about by man himself is that he has acquired the ability to destroy humanity and all life on Earth. Karl Jaspers diagnosed in his book The Atom Bomb and the Future of Man from 1958. 2022, when Russia launched its war on Ukraine, this new situation, so the horror scenario that haunted people's minds during the Cold War, came to life again, even if the technical potential itself never has left us in the meantime. In addition to those 4, or you could say 5 threats, Žižek repeatedly refers to at least 3 different versions of apocalyptic narratives today, which he recognizes as Christian fundamentalist, New Age spiritualist, and technico-digital post-human. Adding to that list in another book, secular ecologism as the 4th version of contemporary apocalyptic narratives. It is especially the ecological changes that humans are confronted with that are on such massive scale that in them an apocalyptic present seems condensed. Contemporary ecology often draws on the apocalyptic framework in the sense that it either consciously tries to apply the apocalypse for its purposes, or, as the term secular ecologism seems to reproach, unconsciously falls victim to it. So with Zizek, we could conclude, we quote, "We live in an age permeated by apocalyptic prospects. There is a multiplicity, a true antinomy of apocalyptic threats." End of quote. However, there is a major difference. The apocalyptic prospects and threats of our present remain without redemption. The end of the world is no longer based on the divine revelation of a coming kingdom. Instead, in scientific modeling, the absolute negativity of total extinction is rendered as a naked matter of fact. So you could say one is confronted with a somehow graceless end with no prospect of resurrection. The future rather appears in the form of an expiring deadline, a soon-to-be-wasted opportunity. In my lecture today, I would like to approach the resurfacing of the apocalypse in our contemporary world from a slightly different angle. Instead of analyzing quasi-apocalyptic phenomena or signs and regarding the apocalypse primarily as a series of events in time that inaugurates the end of time, I would like to focus on the question of temporality implied by it. That means rather than treating it as a threatening or long-awaited event whose occurrence must be either delayed and prevented or anticipated and accelerated, I will discuss it as a problem of the intelligibility of time, so as something that concerns the mode and meaning of time itself. The apocalypse thus will be addressed as a question of temporality, as a mode of situating oneself in one's own time, and thereby relating to time itself. And it is my proposition that this perspective is not some sort of isolated study refraining from the apocalyptic calls of our present, but a precondition for thinking this present properly. In this context, the title of this lecture, Apocalyptic Present or Apocalyptic Presentism, can be read as an equivocation. The present, as a concept emphasized in this title, is equivocal. That means what is implied by the term present will change during my lecture. And in relation, the subtitle, Constructions of Time, is added here to highlight that neither the present or time itself can be presupposed as given. What I mean by all that and what consequences follows from it will hopefully become clear during the lecture. And I'm just going to show you the table or the points I'm trying to address during this lecture. And we are already finished with the first part. So the start is the second chapter, so to speak. To get started with the task of addressing the question of temporality, we could first complement the already given obvious explanation of why the apocalypse is surfacing in our present situation with another equally well-known explanation. A second explanation could be derived when connecting this resurfacing to a critical reflection of modernity. This thesis then would suggest the following. When modernity enters a crisis, it reopens the space for the apocalypse. Modernity's crisis paves the way once again for the apocalyptic worldviews. So it is an explanation concerned with the fact that the historical temporality that shaped European societies from the late 18th century into the 20th century is broken up and transforms. It suggests that when this historical temporality crumbles, not only can latent apocalyptic energies be reactivated or mobilized for various purposes, but in a more general sense, the present seems to recognize itself in those images. It is as if the present is gaining its own contours, becoming intelligible to itself through the apocalyptic lens. And even further, apocalyptic figures of thought serve to orient time itself, shaping how historical temporality as such is constructed and conceived in this present. So we could say this second explanation would interpret the break away from the temporality of modernity as somehow conditioning the possibility of the resurgence of the apocalypse in our present. However, here, the resurgence of apocalyptic energies, images, and figures of thought is not simply the result of some sort of general experience of crisis that we could relate to all fundamental ruptures and periods of transformation. Rather, the revitalization of the apocalypse can be related to specific elements that have been mitigated, redirected, or dissolved during the previous transition to modernity. In other words, it can be linked to structural features whose mitigation, redirection, and dissolution shaped the principle of the modern temporal regime, helping to constitute it in the first place. So, what are these features? With authors such as Löwit, Koselleck, or Blumenberg, the modern temporality is often characterized as the overcoming of eschatological thinking that determines time based on its ending. An influential line of interpretation accordingly characterizes the modern concept of progress as a temporalization of what was previously targeted as the final point. In other words, with modernity, this thesis suggests the ultimate things become process. The end is dissolved in a horizon that constantly relocates and shifts. Here, modernity is characterized precisely by the fact that this history itself is temporalized. Quote, "Time is no longer simply the medium in which all histories take place. It gains a historical quality. Consequently, history no longer occurs in but through time. Time becomes a dynamic and historical force in its own right." So, it's a famous quote by, of course, Koselleck, which is, I think, important here in this context. So, according to this well-known thesis, in the course of such temporalization of history, the apocalyptic worldview dissipates. Instead, the future becomes the fundamental emblem of a temporalized history which now constantly confronts its contemporaries with the radically open, new, and uncertain of the future. And conversely, history then is no longer a foundation from which recommendations for present actions can be derived, but somehow a law of motion, as it seems, that pulls us into the open and forcing us continually to update, reconfigure, and rewrite its inventory. So we could conclude the fact that the apocalypse is reactivated or experiences a resurgence in the present would therefore be preconditioned by the waning persuasiveness of the modern notion of progress. The fundamental orientation of time is changing as if it were once again redirected from the future as its guiding dimension to the present, turning into somehow a presentism. So far, so familiar. But how does such an explanatory approach relate to our present, which is, as we have heard, permeated by apocalyptic prospects? It seems as if it is an apocalyptic or catastrophic present in terms of its fundamental structure. But regarding this structure, our present seems to be one that is not only reinterpreted under apocalyptic science due to a diminishing pervasiveness of modernity's future orientation, but somehow because it is thoroughly catastrophic. It is confronted with temporal and eventual horizons that seemingly promise or anticipate a real or actual obliteration and extinction. In other words, what I'm trying to play around here a bit is the question, isn't the obvious explanation I have introduced at the beginning in some sense stronger than the second explanation? Isn't there a catastrophic or apocalyptic quality of our present that goes beyond the well-known crisis of the temporal structure of modernity? So a quality we cannot solely attribute to this crisis. To make a step further, I will now try to approach the question of modernity's temporality a second time in the third part of my lecture. If one regards modernity with its unique temporal orientation and conception of history rather as an epistemic and economic regime, and therein also as a material infrastructure, a different perspective can be introduced. One could then take a step further and say, in the global space-time of the contemporary, the temporality of modernity circulates today in the form of its negative, that is, as catastrophe and apocalypse. Then the apocalypse is resurfacing not only because of the demise of modernity's temporal orientation, but precisely through the unstable and crisis-ridden form of modernity's global differentiation. So this is here, I want to suggest some sort of a change of perspective, that the apocalypse is resurfacing through the unstable and crisis-ridden form of modernity's global differentiation. What is condensed within the temporal event horizons of the nuclear threat and the ecological transformation to an absolute negativity has accompanied modernity ever since. Its notion of progress based on an alliance of knowledge and economy has not neutralized the apocalyptic elements once and for all. Describing modernity as a configuration of time that has overcome any form of end times orientation, or rather transformed and sublimated it into a progressive historical movement, this description is certainly not incorrect, but proves to be one-sided. It would need to be complemented, as I would like to suggest, by an awareness of how modernity constantly capitalizes on latent apocalyptic elements. Capitalizing in this context means, on the one hand, that modernity is constituted by appropriating and reoccupying the apocalyptic element, not only in its programmatic philosophies of history, but capitalizing also hints at, in a more specific sense, how it makes the apocalypse productive, so to speak. The orientation towards the end, we could say, of the world is not simply rejected in it as a supposed hindrance to worldly production. Rather, in the appropriation and implementation of apocalyptic worldviews and thought figures, surplus is generated. And in its surplus production, the modernity takes on quasi-apocalyptic characteristics. So we are confronted here with two sides of such capitalizing. First, there is a surplus of the apocalypse. An apocalypse releases a surplus. And secondly, surplus value as surplus value production proceeds as an apocalyptic process. Thus, one could conclude, in surplus value, the apocalypse is realized. So this sketch of modernity capitalizing on the apocalyptic element is not intended to replace the thesis I have introduced before, with its emphasis on the incompatibility of eschatology and modernity. Rather, I want to suggest it must complement it. If it is accurate, then one would have to conclude the following. The temporality of modernity, or more precisely, modern self-production, is always at the same time both explicitly post-apocalyptic and implicitly apocalyptic. So this is, I want to especially now think about this kind of double stance in the following. To be modern means, in a way, to be on both sides simultaneously. It means to carry out the apocalypse or to live in its execution, not as a singular event, but as a structure of repetition or as an apocalypse in permanence. And at the same time, it also means leaving behind the apocalyptic frame of time situating oneself beyond the apocalypse, in a beyond, as it were, that is no longer to be thought of as an apocalyptic beyond, so not a beyond opposed to this world, but a beyond precisely here and now. In this context, it is worth recalling Bruno Latour, who in Facing Gaia, his lectures on the new climatic regime from 2015, does not conceptualize modernity as a breakaway or as a break with apocalyptic thinking, but rather as a specific counter-religious appropriation of it. His thesis is directed at how moderns conceive their own temporality and historicity, or in other words, this thesis concerns the spatio-temporal self-location of moderns as a unique mode of existence. Latour bases his reflections on the apocalyptic constitution of modernity not on the secularization thesis, but with Eric Voegelin problematizes a process that he terms immanentization, which touches religious, scientific, and economic registers alike. The main proposition is that moderns have not simply overcome, but immanentized the apocalypse. To be modern, therefore, means to consider the realization of the otherworldly realm as complete, precisely within this world. It means to live at the end of time, understanding one's own existence as the realization of the end of history. And paradoxically, then, the end of time is located in historical time. So in progress, passing time is experienced as something that on the one hand radically differs from the end of time, but on the other hand simultaneously realizes its aims and purposes. The end is then no longer a point near or far, not a point that could be reached in the short, medium, or long term. Instead, this end is a peculiar configuration of conclusion and process at the same time. And precisely for this reason, we could say this form of the end of time must be continually asserted and constantly repeated. We could also think of Alenka Zupancic here, who has argued that Fukuyama's end of history, so a variation of the modern in that sense, was to the contrary, the impossibility to end. Quote, an end that can go on endlessly, forever, end of quote. Here it is crucial that this endless end brings with it a loss of doubt and uncertainty. So modern life at the end of time, which kind of simultaneously fulfills its end, as well as it is a being, a life after the end, so to speak, is characterized by the absolute certainty of already having reached and realized the end. Moderns live after, or more accurately, you could say at, or even within the end of history. And this end simultaneously engenders real ends of the world, as Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Viveros de Castro have emphasized with reference to the history of the native people of the Americas, modernity as causing the apocalypse of others. The apocalypse that moderns leave behind them, in the double sense of the word behind, has already occurred. They assume an explicitly post-apocalyptic attitude with an implicitly apocalyptic self-production. Because it is inherent in the structure of modernity that the end times appear as an overcome past, or rather as a vanquished temporal reference, Latour concludes moderns are insensitive to any form of discourse about an impending doom or end of the world. In such warnings, moderns can only discern a somewhat backward, archaic, or quasi-religious catastrophism. So this is Latour's kind of explanation why moderns, in a way, are insensitive to apocalyptic calls of ecology, so to speak. And the thesis is that having incorporated the end of time, immanentized the transcendence to some extent, this world thus simply becomes the already realized other world. In a sense, in this perspective, moderns have bid farewell to both the beyond and this world alike. Their form of misplaced transcendence makes them insensitive, Latour argues, to the current apocalyptic signs of the new climatic regime, as well as the activities of the terrestrial. So having made this step further, I want to come to a kind of, in the middle, an interim conclusion. We could now ask if the intertwining or fusion of apocalypse and post-apocalypse is, as just described, already inherent in modernity itself. What then to say about the contemporary discursive manifestation of the apocalypse? So what about the reactivization or mobilization of apocalyptic energies and the availability and even apparent plausibility of apocalyptic imagery narratives that we can observe in our present? If our present is marked by the apocalypse, then perhaps not just in the sense of a mere actualization of a structural feature of modernity, nor the crisis or a simple rupture with its temporality. Rather, I want to suggest we live in an apocalyptic present in the sense that the configuration of an explicitly post-apocalyptic stance and an implicitly apocalyptic unfolding of modernity becomes manifest. That is, it appears as a structure, becomes visible, recognizable, as it were. And I think this would be closer to the characteristics of our catastrophic or apocalyptic present. So beyond the reaction to the crisis of the temporal regime of modernity, the apocalypse would then be the mode of operation of the universalized life form of modernity. And the universalization of this life form is enforced exactly through the form of its global differentiation, proceeding under the sign of self-production and surplus value. So with apocalyptic energies, narratives, and figures of thought, what is breaking open or coming to the fore is not the other of modernity. It is inscribed negatively in its structure and constitution. And moreover, and this is crucial here, this apocalyptic structure or feature is revealed under the sign of an aggravation or sharpening, a certain form of resistance, a certain mode of denunciation that is itself an apocalyptic resistance. So almost as an apocalyptic stance turning against quasi-apocalyptic effects or impacts. Because more than ever, we could say the exploitative and colonial structure of modernity comes to the fore in global contemporaneity, inseparably accompanied by its ecological violence. Its historically unprecedented release of industrial productive forces based on an unrestrained resource extraction in alliance with the military technological complex reaches its limits and faces its own finiteness. Therein, the immanentization exhibits cracks. The apocalyptic register resurfaces in the present when modernity confronts its own finitude. Often, in experiencing its limits and finiteness, some people still attempt to consider these constitutive structural features as temporary crises or external catastrophes of nature, and thereby, in some sense, externalize these threats. I would claim that the following, that if the apocalypse is a resistant concept, it must be interrupt or thwart such strategies of externalization and render them impossible. Because here the autonomous self-producing subject encounters dangers and risks, limits and ends. There are nothing other than the effect and articulation of its self-production. If we for a moment shift to the certainly not identical conceptual framework of catastrophe, we could say the following: there are no longer any catastrophes that befall us from the outside, bursting into the societal immanence from the exterior realm of nature. Rather, we are confronted with the catastrophe that modern self-production is. It is a catastrophe indistinguishable from civilization, as Jean-Luc Nancy has pointed out so well. Quote, "There are no more natural catastrophes. There is only a civilizational catastrophe that expands every time," end of quote. Thus, in relation to the exposure of this structure, it seems to me that, of course, the apocalypse today serves as an imaginative realm and a descriptive pattern for current crises. But in that, and at the same time, certainly in conflict with its Judeo-Christian roots, it also functions as an appeal or a call to intervene and act in the face of these disruptions and destructions. In this context, the figure of the prophylactic apocalyptician is prominent, a term Günther Anders used in reference to the nuclear threat in the 1950s, and that was picked up by Latour recently. The prophylactic apocalyptician not only wants his or her prediction of the end of the world to be falsified, but also, by referring to the apocalypse, precisely seeks to change the course of the world. So rather than to wait for the end of the world in favor of a coming kingdom, he or she wants to change the world precisely to preserve it. Against the certainty of the already realized end of the world for Latour, who thereby reverses the conceptual framework of apocalypse, the apocalyptic call is about returning to the world's historicity. So you see, it's a certain form of tension, because you could, in a classical sense, say the apocalypse is all about exiting or leaving the historicity of the world. And for Latour, this call is about returning to the world's historicity. And here, the apocalyptic word is supposed to bring the existence of moderns with a post-apocalyptic subjectivity back to earth, down to earth, thereby reconstituting the earthly, the terrestrial. And to achieve this goal, Latour argues, one has to slip into the role of the prophylactic apocalyptician. And there is one longer quote I want to present here from Facing Gaia, which is prominent in this context. It may seem paradoxical, but to shatter the apocalypse and thus to keep it from falling on us as we have fallen, we Westerners, as an apocalyptic rain on other cultures, we have to return to apocalyptic language. We have to become present again to the situation of terrestrial rootedness. And this no longer has anything to do, as you will have understood, with a return to or a respect for nature. To become sensitive, that is, to feel our responsibility and thus to turn back on our own action, we have to position ourselves through a set of totally artificial steps as though we were at the end of time. End of quote. Could one not conclude then that here the apocalypse is mobilized against the apocalypse? It appears that one apocalypse stands against another, or rather, the apocalypse colliding with itself. On one hand, the apocalypse is an implicit occurrence, a concealed fundamental structure that has to be unmasked, unearthed. On the other, it functions as a dramatic role, as it were, an adaptation in the mode of an as-if. Because Latour speaks, the last sentence I highlighted, through a set of total artificial steps, as though we were at the end of times. So I interpret this as the mode of as-if. So the emphatically charged apocalyptic register is used here not to lead us out of the world, but on the contrary, to make visible the unacknowledged, repressed apocalyptic structure of modernity. This structure has been temporalized as the realization and overcoming of the end times, as the post-apocalypse, and now threatens to lead into a seemingly ecological catastrophe of planetary scale. But can the apocalypse be overcome by recourse to itself? And can it be formulated at all in the form of an as if? So as a form one can adopt, master, and control. Even if we leave aside for a moment the specific frame or construction in which Latour picks up the apocalyptic register, his approach can help us clarifying something important. The apocalyptic present always meets us twofold. The apocalypse, so to speak, is never given as one, so in the figure of the one. With the apocalypse, we rather are confronted with a doubling or a split. It is always as if the apocalyptic present confronts another apocalyptic present, as if the present encounters itself. But that the apocalypse is always engaged and involved in doublings, what does that actually mean? I think it means that not only does the apocalypse appear in two ways, as a material occurrence or a variety of phenomena, on the one hand, and on the other as a discourse, a narrative, a rhetoric with its own set of roles, but also in this discursive context, again, both as a positively and negatively charged figure, which means that it is connected with affirmative deployments as well as being itself subject to criticism. And furthermore, and even more importantly, I would say, so it means that against the implicitly apocalyptic structure, there stands an apocalyptic alarm call, the positioning of oneself as if being in the end of time, as a wake-up call to interrupt the apocalypse. The apocalyptic present thus involves, in a nasty sense, a twofold doubling, since both the implicit apocalyptic structure with its post-apocalyptic consciousness meet an apocalyptic call, the word of an enlightened doomsayer, as it were. So here I'm now circling a bit around and complicating this picture, as you might already kind of got a feeling for, that I'm interested in these doublings and splits and this kind of double or even threefold appearance of the apocalyptic figure in the present. So in the present, in the apocalyptic present, one could say one apocalypse is positioned against the other, which complicates our possible affirmative as well as critical relations to the concept of the apocalypse. And yeah, I think there are some consequences also for our position or activities as scholars follow from that kind of positioning of one apocalypse against the other. So in the last short part of my lecture, I would like to add some thoughts about this apocalyptic as if. I try to say a few more words on how I think it must be constructed to become a resistant force. Therefore, let's change the historical scenery one last time, coming back to a figure I quoted at the beginning of this lecture. In response to Karl Jasper's radio lecture and book, The Atom Bomb and the Future of Man, from 1956 and 1958, the French philosopher and writer Maurice Blanchot wrote a short text in 1964 that even in the face of current apocalyptic discourses poses, I would say, an unheard of challenge. His review essay, The Apocalypse is Disappointing, which is included in this 71 book, Friendship, So his review essay, The Apocalypse is Disappointing, begins with a critique of Karl Jaspers, who proclaimed that the invention of the atomic bomb heralded the total destruction of humanity and fundamentally altered the structure of possible consciousness. According to the German existentialist philosopher, the nuclear threat necessitates a transformation of all human existence, which in turn must be carried out on an individual level by each person. Blanchot, on the other hand, accuses Jaspers of using the threat of the atomic bomb merely as an alibi or a leverage to enforce old values and conservative political positions. Jaspers, in linking the threat of the end of humanity with the threatening spread of communism and the abolition of freedom, allegedly treats total annihilation, so the atom bomb, and total domination, which he perceives communism to be, as two equally imminent dangers between which one must choose. So you see, it's of course a Cold War discussion where Jaspers appears in the role of the guy who tells you either the atom bomb or communism, please choose, or you have to choose, which is, of course, you could say a problematic confrontation. Thus, for Jaspers, it is not ultimately about serious reflection on the newness of the nuclear situation, but rather about the solidification of given patterns of thought formulated in an outdated language. In contrast, Blanchot interprets the invention of the atomic bomb as a mysterious, ambiguous event. It is meant to question humanity in its totality, and at the same time, he argues, the idea of this totality is, for the first time, thinkable through this newness of the atomic bomb, suggesting a possible transformation of humanity as such. The strange disappointment of the apocalypse then lies either in its effect of enforcing existing political positions and rhetoric, but also in its indication of an unmastered possibility, a power wielded by the ruling elite from which those they govern are excluded. So the idea is, of course, you cannot freely choose to use or not use the atomic bomb because, so to speak, you're ruled by people who have the power to decide. The apocalypse is said to point to a power that still eludes humans' capability, which Blanchot therefore characterizes as a negative force. So going back to this text in our contemporary situation would imply the task of identifying tendencies and strategies of referring to catastrophe, doom, and the apocalypse that merely enforce existing political positions. And I would like to underline it also demands an awareness of the britleness of the forms of language we use or the vapidity of conceptual frameworks we might find ourselves in. This task would ultimately also imply coming back to the question of totality, the whole, which is here discussed in this essay as the figure of humanity. In the spirit of Blanchot, I would like to argue to be powerful, to be a force that can match the conceptual substance of the apocalypse, as well as the dangers and threats to which it seeks to respond to. The as-if of the apocalypse must be formulated from the perspective of the whole of totality. In this context, of course, totality does not mean totalitarian. The whole that Blanchot is interested in is certainly not a mere suppression of particularities. Totality does not encompass or include all parts, but rather is something like the general that is present or articulated in the relations and references of the particularities. If one prefers to frame it in a more classical conceptual register, one could say totality here is mediation. The difference lies between a whole that is obtained through multiplication, the addition of parts encompassed and included in the whole, and a totality that is related to structure, that is linked to a form of generality that is not summative, and that does not denote quantitative extent. So the perspective of the apocalypse is one of the whole, I would like to argue, of totality becoming conceivable via its negation. Conversely, this implies where the perspective of totality is absent, one may speak of catastrophes, but not of the apocalypse. Similarly, where today we talk of apocalypses in the plural, with the intention of provincializing their whole, differentiating and diversifying their totality, providing them with a history that may have a variety of appearances and variation, the perspective of totality must be operative on a different level. It must be effective and come to the fore in a different manner if one does not want to diminish the apocalypse, cutting off its edge, diffusing it. Therefore, the practice of multiplying and diversifying the apocalypse must be at the same time, I want to argue, be related to an intensification. You could say a sting or a spike that touches and strikes the whole. Today, the discursive inflation of the apocalypse may be a symptom that this perspective of the whole appears as urgent and is felt or even demanded by contemporaries, being confronted with an oppressive whole, as well as in absence or blockage of a real collectivity. But we must be careful, because the inflation of apocalyptic vocabulary, I think, as we discussed a lot of times in the work of our center, might be, on the other hand, itself become an agent, a medium of normalization. Here I would like also to remind us that the universalization of a conceptual framework, so the application of a concept to a variety of phenomena, the subsumption of diverse manifestations under it, are not the same thing as the whole, the totality that this concept is itself concerned with. So fundamentally, the question then would be, is the expansion of the vocabulary of the apocalypse an indication of an intensification or a symptom of a normalization? The perspective that Blanchot casts on Jaspers confronts us with the question, how do we avoid contributing to a normalization of the situation in our references to events and processes which we interpret in an apocalyptic framework? How do we avoid not just adapting to the existing power relations and pre-given positions, but above all, a diffusing of thinking itself? To put it differently, how do we avoid becoming liberal or conservative in our reference to the apocalypse, in our language, concepts, and thoughts? One can formulate this series of questions in another way, namely in relation to the question I highlighted at the beginning of my lecture. What thinking our present actually means? How does one become a contemporary? How to think the present without simply presupposing its existence, treating it as a given? If we want to avoid attaining just some sort of contemporariness without real contemporaneity, a critical inventory that academic business tends to reproduce, our thinking of the present must be itself, in reverse, the presence of thought. As a concept, I would like to conclude the apocalypse would be a disappointing one when it would turn out to be merely either another object of scholarship or another method of social criticism. Especially in times, most forms of criticism have become institutionalized discourses themselves. The urgency of the apocalyptic call always thrives on an impulse that cannot be captured by institutions, that essentially evades institutionalization. So the apocalypse, and with this sentence I want to end, the apocalypse in its tricky duplications and splits, in its affirmative as well as in its negative extremes, is an elusive force that resides only at the edge of discourse. Thank you.